Thank you. First of all, again, I'd like to just express my condolences to everybody affected by the awful violence in Sudan. Particularly, I'd like to reinforce what Dr. Hoffman's just said. I think one of the things we see a lot in the media at the moment is questions are asked about the pressure that can be exercised on generals in Impunity, and there's a lot less attention on the enablers of Impunity and Burhan, many of whom have the Egyptians and Emiratis have considerable investments in Western countries that the Sudanese generals don't. So I think that's something I definitely want to reinforce that point. In terms of my talk, one of the things we were asked to talk about was the context of impunity and how impunity has enabled the abuses we're seeing in the current conflict. So I'm going to talk a bit about that now, both in terms of the current context of impunity and also the broader historic structural context of impunity for military actors in Sudan and how that shapes what we're seeing now. So obviously in terms of recent impunity, when Burhan and Impunity first emerged as the major players in the Transitional Military Council, as it first was in 2019, neither of two of them were named as people involved, wanted by the International Criminal Court for atrocities perpetrated in the Darfur conflict since 2003. But both of them were themselves deeply involved in that conflict. Impunity as a militia leader, a Janjaweed militia leader, and Burhan as one of the generals that armed that militia leader, armed those militias. Both of them as generals serving on the Transitional Military Council in 2019 were responsible for ordering the breakup of the famous civilian sit-in that had helped bring about the end of Bashir in April 2019, when Burhan and Impunity ordered the breakup of that civilian sit-in in June 2019. That led to a horrendous massacre of civilians, well over 100 civilians. Again, this was a massacre for which there's been no accountability, in part because Burhan and Impunity have gone on to continue to play such a role in the transitional government, leading up, of course, to the current conflict. Also, in terms of the impunity that has facilitated the current conflict, we can look at the institutions of the old regime, the National Congress Party era, the Umar al-Bashir era, that benefited from the impunity experienced by those who had been involved in the previous regime. The most serious trial we've seen has been for the leaders of the 1989 coup. But many of the old regime's institutions have not been dismantled, or those that were have been brought back in another form, like the public order police, or they've started to re-emerge de facto, like the National Congress Party itself was, in spite of being formally banned, practicing activity immediately before the outbreak of conflict. So soon after the original revolution in 2019, the transitional government established a committee known as Lajnat Izala and Tamkin, or the Empowerment Removal Committee, which sought to remove the process known as Tamkin or empowerment, whereby the former regime embedded its partisans in every element of public life in Sudan. However, its work was effectively, the work of this committee, the Empowerment Removal Committee, was effectively brought to an end by Burhan's coup against the civilian component of his own transitional government in 2021. And if we look at institutions from the al-Bashir era that have been playing a role in stoking conflict, one of the most warmongering papers from the National Congress Party, the Al-Intibaha, which the Empowerment Removal Committee tried to deal with, this famously militaristic paper, Al-Intibaha, remained influential, was involved in stirring up unrest in eastern Sudan before Burhan's coup in October 2021, and since the conflict broke out has been one of the most warmongering voices on the side of the army. At the same time, it's important not just to see the crisis today as the product product of an avoidable failure to try particular individuals and institutions. We need to look at a much more long-term structural impunity, which has defined all of Sudan's post-uprising transitions, whether the 1964 to 1965 transition, after the first uprising, the 1985 to 1986 transition after the second uprising, or today's transition. 1964, the first radical transitional government had aspirations to try the military leadership for war crimes perpetrated in what is now the independent nation of South Sudan. That didn't happen because more conservative parties pushed aside the first transitional government, promised the soldiers they wouldn't be tried if they allowed a transition to parliamentary democracy, and you had a transition to an Umma Party and National Unionist Party-led government that continued the war in the regions. 1985, the situation was slightly different in that the leaders of the former regime, or some of them that were in the country, were put on trial to answer for their coup in 1969. So leaders of a 1969 coup were put on trial, but some of them were tried for corrupt accumulation of wealth, but they were never tried for responsibility for the war in the regions, in spite of the fact that war had broken out again in Sudan 2 years earlier. Again, today, you saw the same pattern. People were put on trial for the 1989 coup that brought Omar al-Bashir to power, but there was much more dissimulation about the possibility of putting people on trial for war crimes in Darfur and elsewhere, whether that was through an international criminal court process or through a national process. And the reason for this is that throughout Sudan's 20th and 21st century, wars, throughout the transitions, throughout the coups, the whole security infrastructure, whether that's the intelligence services, the police, and most importantly, the army, has remained dominated at its uppermost echelons by a small cadre of officers with social roots in the northern riverine, in the riverine area to the north of Khartoum, the region that's benefited most from the historic exploitation of the marginalized regions of Sudan, whether that was through the 19th century slave trade, the uneven development of the colonial era, or the post-independence wars in, first of all, the south, then the east, the Nuba Mountains, and Darfur. The civilian leadership of the various historic parties, some of whom are now major players in FFC Central Council or Democratic Bloc, the Umma, the various unionist parties, the Islamists, the Baathists, even to some extent the communists, have been dominated by that same social class, and the bargains that it's historically struck with the military have defined what the Sudanese nation itself is seen to represent. The Umma Party is a slightly different element in this dynamic in that it does have some historic ties to militias in Western Sudan, which again maybe explains some of its relationship with Hemeti in the current dynamic. But anyway, the point I want to make here is that, again, I think there's been a lot of hope today about this principle of returning to the idea of the Sudan Armed Forces as an independent, professional, apolitical institution. But the Sudanese army has never been that, even before the Islamists in 1989, even before the current tussle between Hemeti, the Rapid Support Forces, and the Islamists over the future of the Sudanese army. It's always been political, both in terms of who its officer class represents, its role in the wars, and its role in shaping the Sudanese nation itself. And this is a major factor in why war crimes perpetrated in the marginalized regions of Sudan, whether southern Sudan historically or today Darfur, haven't been prosecuted. Today, the transitional military did not stop two of the indictees of the International Criminal Court, Omar al-Bashir and Abdul Rahim Mohamed Hussein, being put on trial for overthrowing democracy. Of course, it hasn't reached a conclusion yet, and it's unlikely to in the immediate future. But they would never sanction the possibility, really, of them being put on trial, either internationally or nationally, for war crimes in the regions. The one person who has been put on trial by the International Criminal Court is Ali Kushaib, a local militia leader in Darfur, seen by the security establishment as more expendable than people like Omar al-Bashir himself and Abdul Rahim Mohamed Hussein, who are part of that core Northern Riverine officer class. Of course, we have seen a major change. So that explains most of the historic pattern of impunity in Sudan. But of course, one thing we do have to say is there's been something of a shift in this pattern of impunity also today with the rise of Hemeti as a Darfuri militia leader who is trying to effectively reverse this whole security logic in Sudan by seizing power in Khartoum, when historically the role of militia leaders like Hemeti had been to act as Khartoum's instrument in the regions. His own impunity, of course, comes from the considerable wealth and resources he's amassed, all the companies he runs, which we saw discussed in the last talk, his prominent international backers. So Hemeti's abuses and the abuses that are being perpetrated by the Rapid Support Forces in Khartoum right now represent something of a shift in terms of historic patterns of impunity in Sudan that began with the massacre of civilians in Khartoum at the sit-in site in 2019, and of course is continuing right now during the current conflict. At the same time, obviously, the Sudan Armed Forces itself, bombing in Khartoum, bombing heavily populated areas in Khartoum is often also a shift in the patterns of impunity, because historically the Sudanese Air Force bombed areas in the marginalized peripheries of the country that the Sudanese officer class saw as on the peripheries of what they understood to be on the Sudanese nation. Historically, part of the reason that transitions in 64 and 85 happened so relatively peacefully because the protest happened in Khartoum, and the military class was much more nervous to attack civilians in Khartoum. Obviously, this dynamic now seems to be changing. So I guess my overall point is that today's impunity has deep historic roots. We're also seeing a shift in that pattern of impunity as well. Okay, thank you. That's me.